Welcome to the Fretboard Journal Podcast, and happy holidays, everybody. I am your host, Jason Verlinde, the editor of the Fretboard Journal magazine, and today I'm sharing a pretty special interview with you all that probably needs a little bit of an introduction. Guru Singh is a yogi. He is an in-demand speaker. He's been a master of Kundalini yoga for decades, and he's also a passionate guitarist and musician. I've watched him guest on the extremely popular Rich Roll podcast numerous times. My wife and I started following him online, and as a guitarist, I couldn't help but notice all his cool acoustic guitars, including a pretty highly modified Gibson J-45 that we're going to hear all about. I eventually read Guru Singh's autobiography called Buried Treasures, where I learned the full extent of his music background. He grew up here in Seattle, Washington as Gerry Pond. He had a near-death experience. He came out of that and became a popular folk musician around town and was eventually signed to Reprise Records. In 1966, he moved down to San Francisco, playing on bills with the Grateful Dead and Janis Joplin. And then after a rough time in San Francisco, it all kind of ended. This was the Vietnam era. Things were getting really crazy. He was a bit ahead of his time playing anti-war songs. He had a manager who kept hoping he would turn into a Vegas lounge act, not a folk musician singing protest songs. And to compound things, he was a sober person in the height of the Bay Area hippie drug scene. Gerry ended up checking out for nearly a year, taking an epic journey deep into the remote mountains of Mexico. It's all in his book. It's a wild tale. We really didn't even cover the Mexico part during this interview. But when he came back to the States, he transformed into Guru Singh. His music taste had evolved, and his focus was on being a yogi, something that actually had run in his family for generations. But he still loved guitar, and he still does today, and this is an amazing, huge part of his life. And the J-45 that he played in the 60s, he still somehow has, and it doesn't look like it did when it left Kalamazoo, Michigan, I can say that much. I ran into Guru Singh in La Conner, Washington. I was taking a break from the La Conner Guitar Festival. I introduced myself. He's a pretty striking, recognizable guy, and he ended up attending the festival, and we've been talking about me interviewing him for the podcast and the magazine ever since. I think the timing on this one is pretty great. We go a little deep. We talk about dealing with depression. Guru Singh offers a pretty simple breathing exercise that may get you through the holidays, and to top it all off, he surprised me by being pro-guitar acquisition syndrome. So whether you're feeling a bit down in the dumps or thinking about buying a new piece of gear, I think we have you covered on this episode. I know this is a super long intro. I know the Fretboard Journal podcast is pretty eclectic. I can't thank you enough for tuning in. This is what I love, uncovering guitar culture that isn't the stuff that's being force-fed down your throats. And I hope we can get Guru Singh back on the show soon and in our magazine. And if you have any questions for him, hit me up at podcast@fretboardjournal.com. This installment of the Fretboard Journal podcast is brought to you by our friends at Seattle's own Mike and Mike's Guitar Bar. Everyone should be following them. If you need your guitar, acoustic or electric, or even an amp fix, they have you covered. They have an incredible repair staff. We are also brought to you by our friends at Stringjoy Strings. Use the discount code FRETBOARD when you check out for 10% off of your first order, and that works even on their brand new mandolin strings, which they just launched. Over on Peghead Nation, you can find a dozen or so of our favorite musicians giving online roots music lessons across a wide variety of instruments. It's a beautiful place. Get your first month free or $20 off of any annual subscription with the promo code FRETBOARD when you check out. Lastly, cyber season's in full swing, and our friends at Isotope and Native Instruments are there for you. You can get huge discounts on everything from Guitar Rig 7, complete 14 bundles, or one of our favorites around here, Ozone 11 EQ. Go to isotope.com and nativeinstruments.com to learn more. Our 53rd issue of the Fretboard Journal magazine is going to mail in less than a week. I've extended the window to get this issue at no extra cost with your subscription, but you got to hurry. Go to fretboardjournal.com and click on the subscribe button. Issue 53 has a feature with Ben Harper that I wrote, a piece on the late, great Kate Wolf and her favorite guitar. It's a beautiful story and so much more. I'm pretty sure it's our most eclectic and diverse issue to date. It's also one of my favorites. I hope you will check it out. And now, speaking of favorites, here is our first talk of hopefully many with a guitar hero like no other, Guru Singh. Guru Singh, welcome. Thank you for being a part of the Fretboard Journal universe. I feel like I probably owe the world a little bit of an explanation as to how this came to be. I, like hundreds of thousands of others, probably found you on the Rich Roll podcast, which you've been on for 5 or so years.
Yeah.
And through that, my wife and I started following you. She's taken some of the Kundalini yoga classes you've taught virtually. And every time I see you, I see this amazing array of acoustic guitars in the background. And I think to myself, wow, this is incredible. I've got to talk to this guy one day. And then the universe brought us together outside of LaConner, Washington. I was walking with my son down the sidewalk and I run into you. And so here we are.
Yeah. Well, just to give a little bit, further content and context, you were walking down LaConner because there was a guitar festival.
Yes. And then I invited you. I told you should go in there. And I think you even walked through for a minute.
Yeah, well, I did. I walked through to see you and also to support it and there was such great instruments. The amount of luthiers that are practicing their craft in the world today is absolutely wonderful.
Yeah. So through learning about you on the Rich Roll podcast and reading your book, Buried Treasures, I mean, music has been a part of your life for a long, long time.
Yeah, since I was born.
And I want to get into that a little bit before we talk about what you're up to now. So you grew up in Seattle, right?
I did. I grew up actually in the home that you're looking at right here. This was the only home that I ever knew growing up as a child. And what you see is my broadcast studio where I broadcast to the world with yoga and meditation. And this, at one point in time, was my bedroom in growing up. And yeah, I grew up in the arms of a fine artist as a father, incredible fine artist as a father, and an incredible musician as a mother. And so I had an indoctrination into the arts and music at a very, very early age.
And in the 60s, you started playing around Seattle at various clubs and fairly quickly kind of got signed, right?
Yeah, it was a guardian angel kind of event. There were several coffee houses along the avenue, right? University Avenue in the University District. And that was a big hangout for all of the poets and artists and musicians, etc. And there was one club in particular called the Queequeg, which was named after the famous Moby Dick character. And then amongst other coffee houses. And so I was playing there, and the owner and other people that were in that sort of coffee house scene, they knew people and in the industry, and they reached out, and some people came up from the Bay Area. And so I was actually very early on, before any of my good friends, Janis or Gerry or any of the other people that I met after that, when they moved me to San Francisco, I was on a sort of a fast track to recording. But I don't think I really covered it as extensively as it was in the book,
Yeah.
as it was in real life. But, they wanted me to be another Wayne Newton type, right? They wanted me to do the Vegas. So my management got me the recording contract, the management that found me in Seattle got me the recording contract with Warner Brothers. But they had an entirely different idea of what I was supposed to be as a musician.
I was going to ask about that because there's one single by you as Gerry Pond on YouTube that somebody has taken the time to record, and it sort of sounds Donovan-esque, I guess. And I was wondering what kind of music you were playing in those Seattle coffee houses, and then obviously the management's vision was completely different from your own.
Right. Well, that one is one of the ones that one of the several ones that we recorded, and actually had a lot of airplay. Here's the deal. I named it Springtime Notes on Paper Boats, and they changed the name to Happiness Song, right? Okay. And I think the flip side was called Sometime Girl. That was typical of some of my music, but a lot of my music was very much anti-war in the life, because Donovan and I ultimately became good friends, like Buffy St. Marie's Universal Soldier, songs like this, where they weren't just anti-war, they were pro-consciousness, right? Because in her song Universal Soldier, she's really speaking to the men. And nowadays it's men and women, but to the men that would be conscripted into an armed service. And if you refused to participate in this old man's game of waging war, which is really an old man's game, then the old men can't do it, right? And so that was what a lot of my music was about raising the consciousness of the young, vital human beings, so that they would refuse to be conscripted into a killing force. Mm-hmm. And but Warner's wasn't interested in publishing that, and ultimately the FBI got very deeply involved, because even though that wasn't my music that was playing on the radio, and I was getting a lot of airplay, the music that I was performing in person was very much controversial to things like J. Edgar Hoover's COINTELPRO. We always talked about how J. Edgar Hoover had the East Bay, which was Oakland and that area, as the anti-Black Panther movement of the FBI, and the West Bay, which is the San Francisco Marin area, was the the flower children, so to speak, right? Mm-hmm. They were, and the anti-war, and they were, the FBI was really cracking down on all of that back in that day.
You write about that a lot in your book, which anyone who's interested in this should definitely pick up and read. And I was just wondering, I think you said you've been sober. Like, you're probably one of the few people who lived through the 60s who can remember everything.
What is it they say? If you remember the 60s, you weren't there. Yeah, because I was raised a yogi. I was raised a meditator. My great aunt, in 1913, left England for South Africa. And then in 1916, because she was basically running away from World War I, in 1916, she moved from South Africa to India, to Calcutta, India. And she met Sri Yukteswar, who was Paramahansa Yogananda's teacher. Paramahansa Yogananda is the man who wrote Autobiography of a Yogi, which is a huge selling book. And it's sold millions of copies. And so here she is. She's my great aunt, my mother's father's sister, right? And but she had lived right next door to my mother and her sister and mom and dad when they were growing up in England. And so she was like a second mother. So she was very close with my mom. And so she, in 1916, meets Sri Yukteswar and starts to study with him. And then 3 years later, she is sent to Boston with Paramahansa Yogananda to help work with him, etc. And I mean, there's pictures in the museum at the Self-Realization Fellowship of my great aunt standing next to Paramahansa Yogananda and all of the other dignitaries that would gather around this, because it was a significant movement, and still has a strong following. And it's called Kriya Yoga, the yoga that they practice and that I practiced growing up. So this was a huge influence on my household, because she came to Boston, and then in 1924, they came from the East Coast over to California and started Self-Realization Fellowship. And right here in Bothell, there's the Ananda Center, which is an offshoot of the Self-Realization Fellowship. And that was started by Swami Kriyananda, who was a disciple of Paramahansa Yogananda. So all of this was in my world, right? This spiritual, yogic, meditative practice from a very early age. And then, as you know, in the book, at the age of 20, I died for 1 minute and 45 seconds. People call them NDEs, right? Near-death experiences. There's nothing near-death about it. You're dead. You're flat out dead, and they revive you. So it's not nearly dead, it's dead, and then they revive you. But, and so my meditative practice combined with my death experience in 1965, I didn't need any drugs to get high. I was high as a kite all the time. So meditation, yoga, and a death experience will do it for you.
You have these two pillars of yoga and music throughout your life. You moved to San Francisco, which just must be the most fish out of water experience ever, right?
Yeah. Yeah. When I would go to parties with my friends, all of the other musicians that were there, they would have to vouch. The ones that knew me would have to vouch for me that I wasn't an undercover policeman, because I wasn't participating, and I was having just as much fun and experience as all of they were having. They were just either, drunk or loaded.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was definitely a fish out of water. And as a matter of fact, it's probably why I moved away from it so quickly to pursue my experiences in old Mexico, because that to me felt much more aligned with who I was. Music at that time was what I did, but who I was a meditative, yogic, conscious being, and music was a part of my toolbox to expand that into into a presentation, if you will.
Yeah. So how many, there's more than the one single, there's several or a few?
Oh yeah, there was a lot of music that we recorded. And, back in those days, the process was that you recorded singles and they accumulated, and then they recorded the whole album, right? Now they record albums, and off of which they release singles. But back in those days, it was the days of the 45 RPM record, right? It was the days of a record that you would actually buy that had a song on one side and a song on the other side. And so, yeah, we recorded several. I toured extensively. Back in those days, it was bus tours. It wasn't luxury bus tours either. It was, sort of rebuilt bus tours. But I never went internationally, but I went, we performed as far east as Chicago, Oklahoma, Texas. Basically that was the line that was sort of drawn down the United States, and we performed on this western side of that. And I mean, if I'd have stayed in the industry at that level, we would have, we would have taken it even further. But because I was so active in the anti-Vietnam movement, there was some real strong forces trying to silence that effort. Nixon was not in power yet, but it was very similar to what he and J. Edgar Hoover got going in the late 60s, early 70s. And so this was in 65 and 66 when the war was just starting to be built up under President Johnson. And the anti-war movement was just starting to gain tremendous momentum. And they wanted to try to nip it in the bud, but that obviously didn't work. So in San Francisco, I was playing Avalon Ballroom, Fillmore. Avalon Ballroom was the family dog, and the Fillmore was these were the two main, and then there was one that Marty Balins, who was singer-songwriter with the Jefferson Airplane. He and a couple of friends of his bought an old bar in the what was it called, the Marina District near North Beach in San Francisco, and they turned it into it was such a great setting because it was it was kind of an intimate crowd, but all of us went there to try out our new music, right? And then we would go to either the Fillmore or Avalon to actually be on a big stage with lots of people. But it was called the Matrix, and the Matrix was probably maybe a 70 to 90 seat club, and you could get in touch with the audience there, and you could try out new things, make mistakes, do all of those crazy things that happen when you're trying out new material.
So cool. I mean, you were like an early of the more rock and roll counterculture, whatever you want to call it. You were like an early signee to Reprise, and then you got singled out because you were probably protesting before the masses really started to.
Right.
And they made an example out of you.
Yeah, and back in those days, Reprise was almost exclusively Frank Sinatra. That was that was his personal label under Warner Brothers. And so they were trying to select particular artists that they thought would be able to be managed in a certain way. And it was, I recorded in San Francisco at Bush Street. I don't know if Bush Street still exists, but it was one of the early multi-track 2-inch tape studios, and the effects were primitive in those days. Mm-hmm. I can remember they wanted to add some echo, and so they stuck a pencil between the tape and a roller.
Sure.
Right? It was, what is it called? slap back or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, they could double your voice, right? With one part of it just slightly behind the other.
Yeah. What do you remember what guitar you played? Was there one guitar or did you have several?
This one right here. This one I bought on the Avenue in a guitar shop. It's a 1955 Gibson J-45, right? Which, as you know, is a sunburst guitar, right? So this is all new. This is new. This is all new. And there was a guitar maker in Los Angeles called Valdez. On one of my trips, I snapped the head here. And so he was redoing it with, struts back in here. And he said to me, he says, well, do you want me to just redo it or do you want me to make it look really, really cool? And I said, make it look really cool. And I didn't really like the sunburst. So I had him refinish the face. And then he said, well, I'm refinishing the face. So why don't I make a larger pegboard so that we can draw more sound out of, this guitar. And so he actually shaved down the face to a level that would be more resonant. And so this guitar and one of my 12 strings back here, this guitar replaced that guitar as far as the one that I used all the time. It replaced the parlor guitar. Mm-hmm. And then my 12 string back there is a 1957 Epiphone 12.
It's given your life story, which is ready to be, I think, made into a movie. The fact that you still have this guitar is utterly remarkable.
Well, yeah, I'm one of those people that likes to take care of things. I had my father's 69, not Chevy, Buick. I had my father's 69 Buick up until about 5 years ago. And, and then our son and daughter wanted to use the garage that it was parked in for one of their cars. And they said, can we sell this for you? And I said, okay, you can do it on one condition. You can do it as long as you sell it to a collector.
Okay. Somebody
that's going to restore, make it an immaculate vehicle. And so they went to a newspaper or magazine, I think it was, called the Buick Club. And they got the car left here within about 2 weeks of them putting an ad in there. And the man that restored it said, I almost didn't have to do anything to it because you've kept such good care of this, So I said, well, yeah, that's the nature.
That's incredible. So you're recording down in San Francisco, you're playing shows, you're starting to feel pretty uneasy with just, everything. You mentioned Janis Joplin, who you became, it feels like you guys became fast friends almost the minute you got there. Is that how it went?
Yeah, that's because we were both super insecure.
Okay.
So we noticed each other because you can tell when you're in over your head, so to speak, right? Which I just want to say that is normal. Everybody, I became good friends with several, world-class, well-known musicians. And every single one of the ones that are really out there riding the plane on the wing, they're tremendously insecure, and they have to really, really work at it to get that to be able to be presented as an art form, right? And it's probably part of what goes into the mindset of somebody who's willing to go out on a stage somewhere, is that they're just striving to overcome that sense of insecurity. But Yeah, Janice and I, and in the book I refer to her as Tex, and she referred to me as Frog, because my original name is Gerry Pond. I have big eyes, and as a small child, my eyes were even bigger, and so the kids called me Frog Pond, right? There was a joke and a nickname and whatever, and she picked that out really quickly, and she called me Frog, and I called her Tex because obviously that's where she came from. And we were never lovers, but we became brother and sister. And it was a relationship that enabled us both in that 1966 time, before she was really going to hit it big and before I was going to leave the San Francisco scene. You know, we were important to each other. And then, I was friends with a lot of the characters that populated, the Haight-Ashbury at that time, the whole San Francisco scene, West Coast scene.
Who did you find yourself on a bill with more than others?
Grateful Dead.
Okay. Multiple shows.
Yeah. Yeah. Gerry and I became fast friends as well. And because part of the reason was we were both Gerry. Right.
Yeah.
And so that always breaks the ice. And Gerry and I were great friends. I'm friends to this day with their road manager of that time. We're both in our 70s. Well, actually, he's in his 80s. But so we've been around a while, and probably the best of all relationships that we formed were basically formed because we were all doing music, and it was really a whole new category of music because the guitar and rock and roll had been staged for what, 10, 12, 13, 14 years, back to the early 50s. But it was really starting to take off. I mean, the whole guitar band routine out of the West Coast, it was more, keyboards and such, that were coming out of Detroit at the time, keyboard and drum bands. But the West Coast was really strong on guitar. And the scene that I was coming out of here in Seattle was really the folk scene. And so it became folk rock. And what I was heavily influenced by was a lot of jazz. And so if you've obviously listened to the B-side of that single that still exists online, and that was my backing group was played independent of their work with me and the touring with me, and they were called the Jazz Ensemble out of San Francisco. And because that lead instrument on that is a double reeded instrument that not really an oboe. It was something very unusual. And yeah, so we were very much that, the brushes on the snare and brushes on hi-hat open and closed, and it was that jazzy kind of rhythm that I think my friend Donovan had a lot of influence in that too, in his music, just sort of, not that cutting edge lead guitar, riff, but, more of sitting on the back of the beat. Yeah. And letting that carry you forward like a wave.
Was there ever a period where you were asked to or needed to play electric just because of the size of the venue or the style?
Yeah. And I couldn't, how should I say this? I didn't enjoy having a piece of wood hanging around my neck, because they were, for the most part, they were solid body electrics back in that day, right?
Sure.
I mean, the progression into, hollow body in electric guitars, wow. It's remarkable what people are putting into guitars, and, making like half thickness and, elaborate, whether it's an F hole or a round hole. It's I played a Gibson Les Paul and a Fender a Fender Telecaster. But because I was mostly a rhythm guitarist, right? It was just a big clunking, chunking, I never, this was my right hand is much more involved. I'm much more picking out the string that I'm going to hit than running my fingers on the strings, and have been that way my entire life.
Did you have a guitar teacher growing up, or were you self-taught?
Self-taught.
Yeah.
I had a piano teacher from a very early age. I had a violin teacher from a very early age. My mom was my first piano teacher, and then I took from others, and then violin. So, reading music and understanding scale and all of that was very strong. But I think I have had 2 lessons in my life that I consider lessons. After I tell you the context or the content, you won't think of it as a lesson. But my 2 close associates that taught me the most about guitars from a very unusual position, because my chording is not based in scale. My chording is based in geometry, and it's a feel for geometric patterns on the keyboard. So my first lesson was Richie Havens, who was a close friend, and that was a lesson in how to strum. Because, as you know, Richie was the best strummer in the world back in the day. He was just,
yeah.
He was like a combination of flamenco and jazz, and the way he could work with the guitar. And by the way, he had the longest thumb in the universe, and he would get open tunings and he would start playing just barring with his thumb, and then he would every once in a while go back to chording with his fingers, and then go back to barring with his thumb. But he was so profound, and he saw me just standing there in awe, because we were both billed at the Avalon Ballroom, and so I was, off stage, just spellbound by what he was doing as a single man with a guitar, right on that stage. He had a guy playing conga, but that was just an afterthought. What he could do, and the amount of instrumentation that he can make sound come out of his guitar, an acoustic guitar, right? And the second lesson was much later. It was like around the year 1999. My good friend Seal, who he and I have recorded an album together, he's a lefty that grew up poor. And so lefties that grow up poor don't have their own guitar. So lefties that grow up poor are playing a right hand strung guitar with their left hand, right? And so they make these crazy, crazy chords to try to emulate or mimic chords that would be played by a righty. And so when he and I were working together, I was watching him, and my brain, because my brain is very sort of geometric, and people will say, "What's that chord?" And I say, "Ask him." I'm always surrounded by musicians that know a lot more than I do.
Sure.
And so then they'll go, "Okay, well, let me see here. It's a this and a this and a this. Okay, well, that's what that is."
I have so many questions. I want to be respectful of your time, but we've covered up till now just a few years, literally. It seemed like between 1965 and 66, you moved from Seattle's coffee house scene to San Francisco, find yourself in the deep end of the Haight-Ashbury, and then relatively quickly, before you can put out an official full-length record, you're being intimidated by the feds and feeling not like it's not authentic anymore, the music that your management wants you to play. And then you check out and you go deep into Mexico. And this is what most of your book is about. When you came out of that experience of being away for how long were you? It was a year, right?
Yeah, it was 11 months.
When you come out of that experience, what do you, when you grab that guitar again, the very guitar that's to your right, what comes out? What's changed? What's the same?
What came out was less melody and basically more
percussive.
Just it was a drum with sound, with tones, and that's when I really put what I had learned from Richie Havens to work, because the indigenous people, the original people, I'm not always feeling compassionate in my presentation when I call them indigenous, because they're the original peoples. When the original peoples, they didn't have stringed instruments. They had clay flutes, they had wooden flutes, they had wooden drums. They didn't have animal skin drums in the area that I was in, way back in the far reaches of the Carver Canyon in Mexico. And so everything was about rhythm. Everything was about the beat of the heart. So from then on, my music took on a much more of a rhythmic style. And because they would have song in ceremony, music became more about ceremony. And then when I got reinvigorated in my yogic practice by hooking up with Kundalini, then it became mantra, right? Mantra, guitar, rhythm, ceremony, conscious, going deep into, through that journeying of going into that deep journey practice, which is the entrancement, right? The enchanting entrancement of music, which is what music has been for centuries.
Can you explain Kundalini for, I'm sure a lot of our listeners don't know what that is versus just what most people picture as yoga?
Yeah, Kundalini is the mechanism that raises the energy in your body to expand your awareness without the interference of your emotions. Because a lot of times when you expand your awareness, a lot of emotional charge comes up. So being able to ride, as the original people call it, riding the horse or riding the wild horse, that being able to ride that wild stallion as your awareness is increasing, and you're building that perspective of being able to not only experience what you're right here in the 3 and 4 dimensions, right? 3 dimensions of space and the 4th dimension of time, but you're actually going beyond that into what some people would call that psychic or highly intuitive realm. So you're not just seeing what's here, but you're seeing what is coming here, and you're seeing what here came from, right? So you're seeing time in more of a spectrum. And so raising the Kundalini. Kundal is Sanskrit for coiled, like a coil. And lini is Sanskrit for a line, or what it means is a coiled nerve. The line and the nerve are similar. And this rests in what the Chinese doctor, the traditional Chinese medicine doctors, and also the martial artists call the area of the dantian. And that dantian is if you take your belly button and you take your tailbone and you draw a diagonal line between the belly button and the tailbone, halfway down that diagonal line is where this coiled nerve rests. And it's what we call the biometric movement in Kundalini Yoga, or the acuposture, which is where you're in a particular posture, stimulates this area, not only through the posture itself, but also through the depth of breathing that you do in Kundalini, and the amount of work that you do with your belly, with your navel point, to help to propel that breath. And so this is a mechanism that the Kundalini is a mechanism that sort of gets added to the normal yoga postures, are called asanas. The normal yoga that enables you to become very flexible, to become very centered, to become very balanced. And what Kundalini does is it takes that centeredness and that balance and that flexibility and just takes it a little bit further into opening up that sort of, like in mythology, it's called a sleeping giant. And that sleeping giant is that Kundalini force, which then rises up through your spine, and then it circulates. It comes back down through what's called the vagus nerve, and then rises through the spine. And this is what's called the microorbit. And the microorbit is used in martial arts as a centering mechanism. It's used in Qigong. It's used in Tai Chi. It's used in Kundalini Yoga. And so it's that incredible orbiting of this energy that you feel. And so all of a sudden you start to feel like, I'm more of who I am, right? I'm more aware of what is. And then you become that person who can really understand what is taking place in a moment, what's taking place in music, what's taking place amongst people. And that's that's kind of a thumbnail sketch of Kundalini. It's yoga practice and postures and movements, right? With the additional component of really focusing on stimulating that area of the dantian and stimulating that Kundalini to rise up through the spinal channel and then back down through the nervous system, through the vagus nerve. And what's moving, what's actually in motion, is what's called prana in Sanskrit, and it's called chi in Chinese. And in English, it's called life force. And it's basically the energy that keeps you functioning. It's the energy that keeps your cells vital, that qi. In Chinese medicine, they talk about three. There's shen, and then there's jing, and then there's qi. And qi is the one that you use. It's the active one. And jing is your reserve. And it's a little bit like, having a savings account or having an investment. You try to only spend the interest, right? Mm-hmm. But don't spend the principal. And so if you were to think of it in the same way, the jing would be the principal, and the qi would be the interest, the usable part. And then the shen is that which is basically all around all of us. The energy that's just there in the air and in the water and in the food we eat, etc.
Okay.
So that's kind of a brief sketch of what Kundalini is.
I'm guessing you're probably one of the few yogis that also incorporates acoustic guitar.
Well, there are a few. Check out Deva Pramal and Miten. They're really close friends of mine. Miten and I go way back. He was a rocker in the 60s and 70s in England, and then had a spiritual experience that caused him to really devote himself to working in mantric music. And you should listen to them, because they were just the two of them for years, up until about 6 or 7, maybe 8 years ago. And then Miten's rock and roll influence really started to come back. Deva Pramal is his wife, and she's got the voice of an archangel. He's just a master guitarist, and he's a great singer as well. And so his rocker started coming back about, between 6 and 8 years ago. And now they've got a full band, with bass and drums and a variety of instruments, but it's great music. Deva is spelled Deva, Pramal, Premal, and Miten, Miten.
Okay. And where are you at with your music making? Because I see this, there's at least a half dozen guitars in this little room you're in right now.
Yeah.
Most people think of yogis and spiritual leaders as being kind of minimalists, but you're a kindred spirit. You need a lot of guitars.
I need a lot of guitars. I need a lot of instruments, and I need a lot of microphones. So let me tell you. So when I'm actually singing and playing, this is not only wireless, right? Mm-hmm. But it's also, we got that, and and then when we can put a little reverb in my voice. That's a lot of reverb, but I'm just making it obvious, and you're looking at me. I'm sitting in a control room here. I've got a 6-track topped off by an 8-track, so that I can have personal control and then master control. And, and then in LA, I've got a 24-track. I've got an 8-track topped off by a 24-track. So, I'm always basically broadcasting out of a recording studio. And literally the recordings that come out of this room, I record on Logic. And I've got, I don't know if you've heard of a gentleman named John Gilliton, Gilutin. He's, won Grammys. One of them was for the song by Patti LaBelle, New Attitude,
Okay.
He's an incredible producer. He's my current, he's been around me for about 25 years. And so he's a keyboardist and an incredible musician and an arranger. And then Seal and I are going to be working on a new album coming up, and an album of mantra and some, English songs as well. And so we are always. I'm not a minimalist in any way, shape, or form. I am so full of gadgets and things that. I figure that my minimalist days will come when I retire my entire body and they take me to the crematorium. That's when I will be minimalist.
All right. You're encouraging all the people out there who have quote unquote guitar acquisition syndrome that they're doing okay.
Well, I'll tell you, guitars are like friends, aren't they? Each one has a story. Each one has a song. Each one has a lot of songs. I pick up, you can't see, but let me just slide here. Okay, slide this way. So there's 2 more that are right behind me, right?
Yeah.
And there's one that's in the middle there. That's a seagull.
Yeah.
It comes out of Canada. And the other one is the Epiphone 12 string that I got. The Epiphone 12 and this Gibson are the two that came out of the 60s with me. Well, and plus the Washburn there. And so no one that has a guitar collection should have any guilt whatsoever, because guitars are not only friends to us, but they're friends to each other. They love to be in the same room with each other. And one thing that I would impress, and this kind of goes against people that are like, preservationists. Guitars don't like to be sitting around for a long time inside of a case. Mm-hmm. They like air. They like to be visible. They like to be picked up. They like to be played. I mean, yeah. There's nothing like a brand new guitar. It just is such a hard to be a misbehaving teenager. Yeah. Right? Because the wood is new, the glue is new, everything is so new, It's got to get some years under its belt to be able to really have that sweet sound. I mean, there are great guitars that are made and they sound wonderful, but give that guitar that sounds wonderful the moment it comes out of the factory or the shop, and give it 20 years and it's going to sound wonderful plus.
Yeah. You work with a lot of very high-level executives and athletes and presumably musicians. They're probably coming to you for advice, for grounding, for any number of issues they want to talk to you about. Are there some recurring themes that you have to that you could remind us all to think about as we kind of go through this holiday season?
Depression is a tool to be used. It's a time when you have nothing exuding and you're being impressed by the outside world. That is the depression. In meteorology, in the science of weather, a depression is a low pressure area. And that's where the wind blows into, right? Mm-hmm. That's what makes the weather change. So a depression, which a lot of people are having, and a lot of people become depressed around the holiday time because there's so much of the polarity. And a lot of the polarity is just, false exuberance, right? Not really a deep gut felt exuberance, but just kind of frivolity, right? Mm-hmm. And so that tends to make people that are highly sensitive kind of depressed because they don't see the value in that superficial frivolity. And so just understand that depression is just a moment of taking a deep impression. Depression, right, is taking a deep impression. And then you want to use the fire out of the heater in your body, which is the liver. The liver produces the majority of the friction in your body as it's processing the oil-based foods, right? And the fat-based, the solid-based foods. And so the liver is producing this heat in the body. And that heat then is to be used with this diaphragm, get the diaphragm to be loose by deep breathing, mm-hmm. which will release the heat up into the lungs and into the heart. And then all of a sudden, from depression, you will enter into a state of determination, which is basically the heat that is anger. It's translated emotionally. That heat is translated as anger. But when you put it into the container of the lungs and the heart, it's like gasoline in an engine as opposed to gasoline spilled, on the ground. You light the gasoline on the ground, it's an explosion or it's a fire. You light the gasoline in an engine, and it's power, it's strength, it's fuel. And so take a moment in depression to take the impression and then turn it so that it becomes a determination. Determination is known as the wise use of anger. And use the fire of that determination to move you out through that depression into a greater sense of certainty and a greater sense of balance, while you're using the wisdom of the information that you gathered in the depressive state, which is the state of being impressed by what's happening on the outside. And another thing involved in that process is stress. People feel a lot of stress. Well, all stress is just the misuse of that mechanism of putting the heat into the engine, so to speak, of your lungs and your heart, and really starting to use that breath with the lungs and the heart, use that breath to start to put together some intention. Affirmations are a great way of using breath and heart energy, right? Just start telling yourself, I am this, I am that, I am whatever, whatever it is that you want to put into that affirmation. You can even find affirmations, you can read affirmations that are written by others. So that's depression, which takes place in this time of year. That's the stress that takes place this time of year. And also there's the anxiety. So I'll just do those three.
Okay.
And the anxiety is when you have more information coming through you than you're capable of processing. It's like a car that has too much power in the engine, for the body of the car or the wheels or the wheelbase or whatever it is in the car. It would be like putting too much sound through a speaker system. You're going to be getting the crackling. If you don't rip out your speakers, you're going to be getting the crackling of saying you're going to rip out the speakers if you keep this up. And that is there's more energy coming through the system than there is able to be handled by the system. And what you do with that is you just take that anxiety for a walk and take it for a breath walk, where you're very mindful of the fact that you're breathing at the same time that you're mindful of the fact that you're walking. And when you separate yourself into those two very simple categories, you're out for a walk, you're not looking at you're obviously looking to make sure you don't fall down or step into traffic, but you're not mulling things over. You're breathing and you're walking. You're breathing and you're walking. And what this can do is this can channel that massive amount of energy and information that's coming through you into an intentional activity. And so just understand that anxiety needs intentional activity to be able to neutralize or calm it down. That stress needs a chamber in which it can be that fuel. And depression needs a fire. First of all, the impression needs to be allowed, but you don't want to let it go for too long because it then can become a habit pattern. So the depression allows the impression to take place, and then journal on that so that you're not going to lose sight of the messaging, and then begin to really propel yourself. We all have to deal with all of these things. There's nobody that's beyond them.
You make it sound easy. I know it probably isn't for a lot of people. You've been practicing this for decades. Is there one particular breathing exercise you find the most Swiss Army knife for most people, or is it kind of
3 breaths per minute?
3 breaths per minute?
Yeah, get a timer on your phone. Inhale for 10 seconds. And it won't take you 10 seconds to make a full inhale. So you just inhale and you hold it. And then at the 10-second mark, you do what's called an ujjayi breath. Exhale using a tight throat. Now you can exhale with that kind of a throat, and you can exhale for the whole 10 seconds. Then you and hold it for the remainder of the 10 seconds. And then you're exhaling. And do that for 1, 2, 3 minutes. 3 minutes is really great. And that's 3 breaths per minute. And when you breathe, push the belly out as you inhale. It drops the air into the lower 1/3 of the lungs, which will oxygenate more blood, because the lower lung has a richer collection of alveoli sacs, the little sacs that are capillary rich, that is transferring blood into the system, transferring oxygen into the system. And so by pushing the belly out, it drops the air into the lower lungs. Yeah, here's a funny fact. Normal day activity, we use 15% of our lungs. Normal, everybody, everyday activity, 15% of our lung capacity, because the other 85% of our lung capacity is in restoration mode. Because those little alveoli sacs, they have to be able to have that osmotic activity, right? They need to have oxygen to pass through the membrane, but no blood to bleed out, right? It's a crazy, crazy, crazy process, right? Magical process. And so those are in constant need of repair. And then the water that's effervescing up from the kidneys through the adrenals, through the diaphragm, into the lower portion of the lungs, that is the water that comes into the lungs to be also taken out by the blood supply. And that's why, water in the lungs happens when people have pneumonia and the lower portion of their lungs gets blocked off, right? So all of this is the reversal of that. This is using that moisture that's coming up to liquefy your blood, so your blood is really flowing and really circulating and really distributing that deep oxygenation.
Wow. You've given us lots of food for thought.
I love it.
I feel like we've barely scratched the surface of you and your career and what you're up to these days. I want to invite you to come back as many times as you want. Maybe people can even submit questions for you if you're ever game. And come to my office in Seattle so we can record you properly too. That would be fun.
Perfect. Yeah, we will do that. I look forward to it. I love doing podcasts. I love being interviewed. And just a shout out to all of you who are in Jason's world and, in the world of guitars and fretted instruments, or even fretless guitars, right? Just keep your life healthy. Keep enjoying your music and your musical instruments. Keep making them, and keep relating to fretboard.
Thank you so much, Guru Singh. All right, that was my chat with Guru Singh. I hope you enjoyed it. Send me feedback, podcast@fretboardjournal.com. Let's get him back on the show again. And most importantly, everybody, take care of yourself and enjoy the rest of 2023.